Okay, hi. Good afternoon. Well, it's afternoon now. You might be looking at this in the middle of the night. Okay, doesn't matter. That's the magic of virtual, virtual education here. Okay, hey, I'm Anthony Balzano. I am a professor of anthropology and sociology here at Sussex County Community College in Newton, New Jersey. And this recording is for Anthropology 101, Introduction to Anthropology. It's the fall semester right now. Um, uh, uh, Today, what we're going to do is cover Chapter 6 on the emergence of modern Homo sapiens from our book, The Human Story by Alexandra Brewis and other authors. I just call this the Brewis text. And we're going to cover Chapter 6 that starts on page 155. Now, if you have any questions about this recording, you can contact me at abalzano dot abalzano at sussex.edu. That email address, you could email me on that. Okay, so chapter 6 is about it's all about Homo. We stopped the last chapter, we finished the last chapter when we talked about Homo habilis, and there we were still in what we would call the lower Pleistocene. Okay, this chapter is entirely, well, 95% is in the middle Pleistocene. Uh, I say 95% because the last 5%, Neanderthals, which are in this chapter, Homo neanderthalensis, goes from the upper middle Pleistocene or the middle Pleistocene to the upper Pleistocene. Okay, now the fossils that we're going to cover in here start at about 1.8 million years ago, and it brings it right up to 300,000 or 0.3 million years ago. When we kind of divide it into two at around the mark of 800 million years ago, from 1.8 to 8, 1.8 to 0.8 million years ago, we're going to talk about Homo erectus, and then starting at around 0.8 to 0.3 million years ago, we'll talk a little bit about Homo erectus, but then also about what we're going to call the middle Pleistocene homos. Okay, and that would include Homo ergaster, Homo heidelbergensis, that we have here today. We have some folks here today who are going to join me here. Okay, here's Homo heidelbergensis from the middle Pleistocene. That's about a half a million years ago, and then we also have Neanderthal, which is from this Neanderthal here is from about 100,000 years ago, this particular fossil find. Okay. Okay, so let's look at some of our fossils. A good part of, actually, this chapter starts off talking about a very different tool culture of Homo erectus called Acheulean tools. And one of the things they document there and they explain there is that Acheulean tools are much more complex than old wand tools. There are approximately 25 different sets of instructions that you have to remember, that Homo erectus remembered to create a Acheulean tool, which is more of a hand axe. So talks about the tool culture is very different, which means the brain was very different and it was much more complex and was able to take care of a lot more forward thinking and imagining what was in a rock and then making that rock, chipping away at that rock in different ways to make a hand axe out of it. And that was what Homo erectus was capable of. Homo erectus is an amazing fossil. It lasted for a really long time. It was around far longer than Homo sapiens have been around so far. And the most important thing about Homo erectus is it left Africa. It emerged at around 1.8 million years ago. And by 1.75 million years, about 50,000 years, it showed up in the Caucasus Mountains of far eastern Europe, in the country of Georgia, okay, the Republic of Georgia today. Now, if you go to page, one of the cool maps so far right here is on page 158, which shows the kind of fossils of different kind of fossils of different types of Homo erectuses, and they're right there. And so it emerged about 1.8 million years ago. Certainly by around 1.7 million years ago, it was in Dmanisi, Georgia, and by 1.6 million years, it was in what is today Indonesia, the island of Java. We find Homo erectus fossils. In fact, one of the very first Homo erectus fossils that was ever found in the late 19th century was in Java. Okay, and they used to call it Java Man. Then they found a similar one near Peking, and they called it Peking Man. Today we know that they're all Homo erectuses, and that they got there by way out in Asia. They got there by about 1.6 million years. The one up in Peking was about 1.5 million years, and then we finally see them show up in Europe, which is much closer to Africa than China and Indonesia, right? But they don't get to Europe until about 1.4 million years. Why? Well, because most of Europe was encrusted in glaciers back at that time. And so some of the more famous fossils that we see is in Kenya, the very first ones. And your book talks about that really super famous fossil on page 160, and that is known as Narikotomi boy or Turkana boy. It was found near Lake Turkana in northwestern Kenya. And what's amazing about it is that it is nearly a full skeleton, and that it was pretty tall, and it's been dated probably only being around 8 to 10 years old. They thought it was more like 15 years old, but now they know that it was a lot younger than that, and it was nearly 6 feet tall at around 10 years old. And this tells us that Homo erectus was, from the neck down, it was identical to Homo sapiens. From the neck up, it was very different looking. So here is a Homo erectus. Let me show you a couple of things on this. This is a Homo erectus skull, and what's a telltale sign of Homo erectus is the brain starts expanding out this way, and it creates a long, low skull. And this part here is known as the occipital torus, or the occipital bun. Your book calls it the occipital torus, Torus. And that's one thing it has. It also has a much reduced sagittal crest, okay, here. And I don't have a Homo erectus fossil that shows a sagittal keel. The sagittal keel is when this bump on the skull goes this way, okay? And when we see any skull with a crest, a sagittal crest that goes this way, a bump in the top of the skull that goes like this, it means that they were using their very front teeth as tools. And that's amazing, okay? And so when we see very front teeth being used as tools, it's sometimes known as the third hand. I still rip bags of potato chips open with my teeth, okay? And sometimes I'll use my teeth for other things. Of course, don't tell my dentist that, because they'll get really angry with you, because they got to deal with broken teeth. And when we start using teeth as tools, the other thing that starts to emerge later on with later Homo, sometimes, I don't think it's ever been found with Homo erectus, is we see tooth wear only on one side. And what that shows is brain bilaterality. So the brain starts to get a right-handed and a left-handed side of the brain, and we see teeth only wearing out on one side. It means that the brain is starting to become more complex. And so we start to see that tooth wear with Homo erectus, and then later in the homos between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, we start to see that emerge quite a bit. So Turkana boy was probably, if he ever lived to be an adult, he died young. By the way, they're pretty sure he died of an abscessed tooth, okay, which can kill you if you let it go. That infection in your tooth could like just poison your entire body, because he had big rot on the side in one part of his jaw. But he probably would have grown to well over 6 feet. That is, he has the entire stature. By this time, Homo erectus has the stature of Homo sapiens, or what we're going to call in this chapter anatomically modern humans, and that's who we are. We're anatomically modern humans. Now, the other really cool thing they talk about with Homo erectus is a fossil site at Illirit. It's very similar to the fossil site we see at Laetoli in the previous chapter where we find footprints of of Australopithecines at Lake Tolly. At Illirit, we find footprints again in volcanic ash of Homo erectus, and that's described on page 161. It's real important. Okay, one more thing about Homo erectus is that by the time they emerge at around 1.6, 1.5 million years, the brain has expanded about 50%. It goes from being around 550 cc's to around 800 cc's. It really grows quite a bit. And so Homo erectus has a much larger brain per size relative to its body size than Australopithecines. Okay, so the brain really starts to expand. Now, let's move now over to what the book refers to as Middle Pleistocene Homo. But these are really, if you look at the dates, what they're really talking about here, and I have to tell the authors to sort of tweak this a little bit, it's later in the Middle Pleistocene, starting at around 800 million years. So it's a good million years from Homo erectus till we start to see Homo become a little bit more sapien-like. And that's with the likes of, this is Homo heidelbergensis. It's got it has more of a forehead. It's got a little bit flatter face to it, okay? And the occipital bun it's more rounded like this, all right? And it's found with a more sophisticated kind of toolkit. It's no more Acheulean toolkits. They're more sophisticated kind of tools. Now, this is called Homo heidelbergensis because it was found in Germany, okay? And similar fossils like this, as your book talks about, were found in Africa also, but I don't have a fossil like that. We have to order one of those and see if the college can get me one of those on that budget. Now, on page 163, it talks about how the brain starts to expand even more, because for these Homo fossils after 800,000 years, the brain starts to get up to from 800 to at least about 1,000, or maybe even 1,200. And on page 163, it talks about how they know how they know how big those brains were by taking endocasts of the inside of a skull and getting the impression that the skull makes on the bone. They can say something about the complexity of what those brains were like. Now, on 163, it kind of gives a really nice depiction about what that brain looked like. And it's not the size of the brain that says something about its complexity. Its complexity is within the brain, and it's the way the brain becomes wired. And because they're making more complex tools, because it has more steps to them being made, these brains were definitely much more complex in how they were wired together than early Homo erectus, and certainly of Homo habilis, and certainly of Australopithecines. But what we see with Homo, especially after 800,000 years, is we see a very rapid increase in brain size. And what we see is that this correlates at the same time with the more extensive use of fire, okay? And fire is super important for diet, and you're going to get much more nutritious food when you cook it. And because they were using fire and had hearths, and there's evidence of deep layers of many tens of thousands of years that they were using fire in the same areas, they're getting a much more nutritious diet, and at the same time, we see the brain grow. So we don't have direct evidence of it, but we seem to see that when Homo starts to eat cooked food, it's one of the things that contributes to brain growth. There's other contributing factors to brain growth, and one of them is definitely has something to do with the ability to persistently run. Now, what does running have to do with brain growth? Well, what happens when you persistently run and you're walking long distances, which is what Homo erectus did, right? They walked from Africa to Asia. Okay, they were always on the move. When you are doing that, you are respiring a great deal to feed oxygen to your muscles. And a byproduct of that is to feed oxygen to your brain. And so when you are respiring a great deal, like if you go out and run a mile, you're feeding your brain. Okay, you're feeding your brain, and it seems like there was a genetic adaptation to all this cool oxygen coming into our system, and one of the things is it allowed the brain to expand. Okay, and a lot of folks who run or people who are therapists, etc., say go out for a walk. Okay, it improves your mood, and it does improve your mood. All right, so here we are. After 800,000 years, we have Homo fossils that are starting to look more and more like sapiens, and we see them emerge in Europe, in Africa, and in Asia. These later types. Now, what's interesting is that one of the fossils that's in Africa. Let's see what page that's on. Where they, if you go to page. They show the early homos. It's on page 172. Okay. Now, there's a really interesting fossil here. Let's say the one like at Kabwe, okay, which is in Zambia, which is an early an early Homo fossil. By the way, these homos after 800,000 years are known as archaic Homo sapiens. Okay, they are very, very similar to the fossils that we find in Indonesia. What that tells us is that there must have been a genetic connection, and that's the kind of evidence that we see that would support what we call an out of Africa theory. Now, when we find these later homos, these archaic Homo sapiens that look very different from the ones that we see in Africa, that's evidence that supports what we call the multi-regional theory of human evolution. And your book briefly talks about that. And then the final theory about human evolution that they talk about, besides out of Africa and multi-regional, is the assimilation theory. And what that says is that archaic Homo sapiens did evolve in Africa, then they left Africa, and then they assimilated with the existing Homo erectuses that were there, and some of that went on. We certainly see that also happen with archaic Homo sapiens and anatomically modern humans who leave Africa and interbreed with archaic Homo sapiens like Neanderthal. Okay, and that's why a lot of people who are not ancestral to Africa have some Neanderthal genes. Like I have about 5% Neanderthal genes. Okay, and there's a similar kind of archaic Homo sapien that was from Asia, known as the Denisovans, all right, and there are Denisovan genes in some Asian and Pacific Oceanic populations, okay, also. And so that supports the assimilation theory, all right. Anatomically modern humans start to emerge at around 300,000, definitely 200,000 years ago. Okay, we have some really great fossils from Africa, in Morocco, 300,000 years ago, from Herto from Ethiopia at 200,000 years ago, from Omo, Ethiopia at 160,000 years ago, first anatomically modern humans. And we see them, later on emerge outside of Africa at around 50,000 years. Now, if you want to see where that is, okay, if you go to page 177, those dates there on that little map on page 177 shows the very first time anatomically modern humans show up in those parts of the world. And so you can see that we don't get to Europe until around 45,000 years. Okay, but we actually get to Australia at 65,000 years. Again, it was easier to get into Australia out of Africa than it was to Europe because it was locked up. It was more glaciated, and we don't get to the Americas until about 15,000 years over the Bering Strait. And the last place Homo sapiens show up is in the Pacific. Okay, in the South Pacific. And remember, they had to figure out how to navigate the ocean in outrigger canoes to get to those parts of the world. Okay. One of the things that we start to see whenever we see anatomically modern humans is evidence of their behavior. So archaeology kicks in here, and paleoanthropology kicks in here, where we're starting to find evidence of their behavior, evidence of their ritual behavior, and evidence of their art. And from page 179 on, it talks about those things. Now, some of the telltale signs of anatomically modern humans are the brain is even bigger relative to body size. Okay, anatomically modern humans tend to have smaller brains than Neanderthals and Denisovans in all likelihood. But remember, Neanderthals had huge body sizes. They were massive in the amount of muscle that they had and the amount of bulk that they had. And their brains were a little bit larger. But when we become anatomically modern humans, we become more. Our bone structure becomes lighter. Our bone structure becomes more what we say gracile, more graceful looking. We are a much more gracile form of Homo sapiens, and our brain is almost the same size, but our body is not as bulky. The other thing is that our teeth become a little bit smaller, but not small enough, okay, to fit our reduced jaw size. The other thing that happens with our skull is not only does our jaw size become smaller because we are eating softer foods because we're cooking them, and our teeth become a little bit smaller, but again, not small enough for our skull structure. The other thing that happens with anatomically modern humans is we develop a chin. Okay, Neanderthals, other archaic Homo sapiens do not have chins. And we think it's a remnant of our face becoming smaller and our head being pushed up by that expanding brain and less muscle in our head. So we have that chin, we have a lighter bone structure, we have a little bit smaller teeth, and we have a much more enhanced kind of brain structure that probably benefited from a gene mutation called the FOXP2 gene that allowed for us to develop speech, that connected our brain structures with our mouth structure, with our thought structures, and that developed the ability to speak. A really neat chart here on page 177 is on figure 6.25, and it shows that as anatomically modern humans emerged and moved away from Africa, they became less genetically diverse. That the most genetically diverse anatomically modern humans are Africans. Okay, they have a much wider array of different kind of genes. And as we moved away from Africa, that is, as we split off, we took only a percentage of genes with us, and we became less genetically diverse. Okay, and that's what that shows. That's an important part. The thing about Neanderthals is that they were so big and bulky because they were cold adapted. They lived in a glacial environment. They went up to what we call up to the Arctic. They went up to northern Siberia. They were in northern Europe. They were in mountainous areas. They lived on a very a mountainous, rocky terrain, and they were almost primarily hunters. Their diet was much more meat than any other Homo species. And so were the Denisovans. The Denisovans are kind of like Siberian Neanderthals, but they are genetically different. Neanderthals emerged at around 400,000 years ago, and they existed up to around 35,000 years ago. That's pretty recent, right? Okay, and so that means they were there at the same time as Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans were. And so if you go to just in Europe, and there's the map on page, they show the extent of where Neanderthals were. It's in the chapter there. Okay, it was in all of Europe and all of Eastern Europe and in parts of Western Asia. They extended out into that far, and so they were contemporaries with Homo sapiens. So it makes sense that there was some inbreeding that goes on here, and why a lot of humans today have Neanderthal genes. Okay, so enjoy. Enjoy. You could channel your inner Neanderthal, okay, if you want. And we will see you again for chapter 7. Okay, thank you.